Some promises are never spoken out loud, yet they become the only reason someone keeps waiting. The evening air settled gently over Camp Pendleton, carrying the familiar scent of salt from the Pacific Ocean through the quiet rows of the military working dog kennels. The last rays of sunlight painted long shadows across the concrete walkways while distant flags moved softly in the coastal breeze. Inside one kennel, Atlas lay motionless in the far corner with his back turned toward the entrance. His stainless steel food bowl remained untouched. The water beside it reflected the fading orange light, perfectly still. 3 weeks had passed since Staff Sergeant Caleb Rowe disappeared during what had been scheduled as a routine field inspection in the hills east of the base. Every official search had ended without the answer everyone hoped to find. The Marines returned. The vehicles returned. Even the equipment eventually returned. Only Caleb did not. Since that morning, Atlas had changed in ways that no training manual could explain. He was not aggressive. He never barked at the handlers who cared for him each day. He accepted water when it was quietly placed beside him and calmly allowed veterinarians to complete their examinations. But he no longer responded to commands. He no longer walked willingly onto the training field. Most of all, he refused to look toward anyone who spoke his name. A new handler had been assigned earlier that week. The young Marine understood the importance of patience and never tried to force Atlas into obedience. Every evening, he entered the kennel carrying the familiar tactical lead, placed it gently on the floor several feet away, then sat quietly without speaking. Tonight was no different. He lowered himself onto the cool concrete outside the kennel gate and waited. Atlas never turned around. The only sounds came from seabirds gliding overhead and the faint clinking of a flagpole somewhere beyond the training grounds. Minutes passed without movement. The Marine finally whispered, "I am not here to replace him." Atlas remained completely still, his ears barely moving as the breeze carried unfamiliar voices across the base. The words were kind, but they were not the words he had been waiting to hear. Across the compound, inside the communications building, technicians continued reviewing damaged radio equipment recovered during the search operation. Most recordings contained nothing but broken static and fragments of weather reports interrupted by interference from the rugged terrain. One technician adjusted an aging receiver connected to a restored memory unit recovered from the hillside. Another slowly increased the volume while attempting to separate background noise from damaged transmissions. At first, only soft waves of static filled the room. Then came the faint sound of wind moving across a microphone. A metallic chime echoed somewhere in the distance. One of the technicians leaned closer, believing he had imagined it. Suddenly, beneath layers of interference, a tired but unmistakable human voice whispered a single word. "Atlas." At that exact instant, nearly 100 yards away, the German shepherd lifted his head. His ears stood high. Every muscle tightened beneath his black and tan coat. For the first time in 21 days, his eyes focused on something beyond the kennel walls. Before the startled Marine beside him could react, Atlas rose to his feet, crossed the kennel in 3 determined strides, and stood facing the closed gate with complete certainty. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stared toward the communications building as though the distance between them no longer existed, and somewhere deep inside him, a promise that everyone else believed had already ended suddenly felt alive again. The sound of that single word echoed through Atlas long before anyone inside the communications building understood what they had found. While technicians replayed the damaged recording again and again, the German shepherd remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the distant building as if every memory inside him had suddenly awakened. Weeks earlier, before silence replaced routine, every morning at Camp Pendleton had begun the same way. The first hint of daylight stretched across the parade grounds while a cool breeze carried the scent of ocean mist over the training fields. Staff Sergeant Caleb Rowe always arrived before sunrise with a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and Atlas's favorite worn leather ball tucked beneath the other arm. He never hurried. Atlas would already be waiting inside the kennel, sitting tall without making a sound, watching the familiar footsteps approach. Caleb always paused before opening the gate. Instead of speaking immediately, he smiled first. Atlas answered with a slow wag of his tail, not because he had been commanded to move, but because he recognized the person who had become his entire world. Every morning began with the same quiet ritual. Caleb unclipped the tactical collar for just a moment, brushed loose fur from Atlas's shoulders with steady hands, checked each paw carefully, then fastened the collar again with the practiced confidence of someone protecting a trusted partner rather than preparing a working dog. They walked across the base side by side without tension on the lead. Other Marines often joked that Atlas knew Caleb's thoughts before Caleb himself did. They were only half joking. During obedience drills, Caleb rarely raised his voice above a calm conversation. A simple glance to the left sent Atlas changing direction. A slight movement of Caleb's hand signaled when to slow down, when to stop, or when to continue. Visitors frequently assumed invisible commands were being given through hidden electronic devices. The truth was far simpler. Years of shared mornings had built a language that required almost no words. After every training session, they crossed a small wooden footbridge leading toward the coastal trail overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Caleb always stopped there for exactly 1 minute. He leaned against the weathered railing while Atlas rested beside him, ears turning toward the crashing waves below. Some mornings neither of them moved at all. The breeze carried the smell of salt, eucalyptus trees, and damp earth as seabirds circled overhead. Caleb often laughed softly and scratched behind Atlas's ears before saying the same sentence that never sounded like a command. "You do not follow me. You walk with me." Atlas always looked up at him after hearing those words, his steady brown eyes reflecting complete trust. Before returning to the busy rhythm of the base, Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the old leather ball. Atlas caught it every single time, no matter how far Caleb tossed it across the open grass. The game always ended the same way. Caleb knelt beside him, rested one hand gently against the tactical collar, and spoke one quiet word. "Home." Atlas never hesitated. Whether they were standing on a training field, beside a patrol vehicle, or overlooking the ocean, that single word meant the day would end together. It was never simply the destination waiting beyond the kennel gates. It was the promise that no matter where duty led them, one would never leave the other behind. Neither of them knew that one ordinary sunrise would become the last morning they would hear that promise spoken face to face. The memory ended where every promise still felt unbreakable, but the next sunrise carried a silence no one could have predicted. Heavy rain had swept across the eastern hills for 2 straight days, leaving narrow service roads damp beneath scattered oak trees and low clouds hanging over the ridgelines. The mission briefing that morning sounded routine. A temporary communications relay near the hills had stopped responding after the storm, and a small inspection team would verify the equipment before another weather front arrived. Staff Sergeant Caleb Rowe volunteered without hesitation. The assignment was expected to last only a few hours. Atlas watched from the kennel as Caleb loaded a backpack into the utility vehicle. The German Shepherd stood unusually close to the gate, following every movement with quiet attention. Caleb walked over before climbing into the driver's seat and rested both hands against Atlas's neck. The familiar tactical collar clicked softly as he adjusted its buckle one last time. "Easy, buddy," Caleb said with a gentle smile. "I will be back before dinner." Atlas remained standing instead of relaxing as he usually did. When Caleb turned toward the vehicle, the German Shepherd lowered his nose and gently caught the edge of Caleb's work glove between his teeth. It was not a playful gesture. It was calm, careful, almost like a quiet request. Caleb chuckled softly and reached down to free the glove without pulling. "Not today," he whispered. Atlas slowly released it, but never looked away. As the vehicle rolled through the front gate, Atlas stayed exactly where he was, watching until the taillights disappeared beyond the coastal road. The kennel attendants noticed he skipped breakfast that morning, something he had never done before. By noon, dark clouds gathered again over the eastern ridges. Inside the operations office, routine radio updates became less frequent as the inspection team entered areas where signals often weakened. No one considered it unusual. The terrain had always interrupted communications. Hours passed. The afternoon sun slipped behind another layer of gray clouds. Scheduled check-ins were missed once, then twice. Technicians attempted repeated calls over multiple frequencies, but only broken waves of static answered. The operations room grew noticeably quieter. Maps were unfolded across long tables. Weather reports were reviewed. Vehicles were prepared. Shortly after sunset, One utility vehicle returned through the gates of Camp Pendleton under escort. Mud covered its tires, and rainwater still dripped from the doors. The driver's seat was empty. Caleb was not inside. Search teams immediately retraced the inspection route using floodlights, mapping equipment, and every available communication channel. They found tire tracks disappearing near a narrow maintenance road and recovered a damaged portable radio, partially hidden beneath wet branches. A small locator wristband belonging to Caleb was discovered several yards away, still functioning but separated from its owner. There were footprints, washed nearly invisible by the rain, leading toward dense brush before fading completely into soaked earth. The search continued throughout the night and into the following days. Helicopters crossed the valleys. Ground teams explored ravines, service trails, and abandoned utility paths stretching for miles. Every report ended the same way. No confirmed sighting. No reliable signal. No answer. Back at the kennel, Atlas sensed each vehicle returning before anyone else did. Every time headlights appeared beyond the gate, he rose immediately, ears forward, hope filling his steady brown eyes. Each time another Marine stepped out instead of Caleb, Atlas quietly sat back down without making a sound. As one evening faded into another, the entire base slowly accepted that the search had become something very different from the simple mission that had begun with an ordinary promise to return before dinner. Days blended together until even the calendar seemed to lose its meaning. At Camp Pendleton, the morning bugle still echoed across the base, the flag still climbed into the bright California sky, and patrol vehicles still rolled through the gates before sunrise. Life continued because it had to. Yet for Atlas, time had stopped on the morning Caleb Rowe drove away. Every afternoon, almost to the exact minute Caleb had always returned from training, the German Shepherd walked to the front of his kennel and sat facing the entrance road. He did not pace. He did not bark. He simply waited with quiet determination, watching every vehicle that approached through the security gate. The kennel staff soon realized they could predict the hour by Atlas alone. Even before the sunlight softened into gold, he would already be sitting there, ears raised toward the distant sound of engines carried by the coastal wind. When unfamiliar Marines stepped from the vehicles, Atlas lowered his head without disappointment showing on his face. He only turned back toward the empty kennel and waited for the next day. The veterinarians confirmed he remained healthy, although he ate only enough to satisfy hunger. His strength never faded, but the joyful energy that once carried him across every training field seemed locked away somewhere no one else could reach. One evening, a senior handler quietly carried a folded field jacket into the kennel. It had belonged to Caleb. The fabric still carried traces of salt air, leather gloves, engine oil, and the faint scent of the eucalyptus trees that lined the coastal trails where Caleb and Atlas had trained together countless mornings. Atlas approached slowly, lowering his nose until it almost touched the sleeve. He breathed in deeply, then gently gathered the jacket between his teeth and carried it into the far corner of the kennel. There he carefully arranged it beneath his chest before lying down with one paw resting across the folded fabric. No one tried to move it again. Every Marine who passed the kennel understood without a word that the jacket had become more than clothing. It had become the closest thing Atlas had to Caleb's presence. Search teams continued working beyond the base, following every possible lead through hills, abandoned maintenance roads, dry creek beds, and forgotten utility routes. Reports arrived each evening with careful optimism, but no lasting answers. Helicopters returned with empty cargo bays. Ground crews washed mud from their boots before quietly preparing for another dawn. Hope never disappeared completely, but it became softer, more fragile, carried carefully from one day into the next. After nearly 3 weeks, command officers faced a difficult decision. Atlas remained one of the most capable military working dogs assigned to the installation. His training, experience, and remarkable instincts were too valuable to leave and used indefinitely. Regulations required that he eventually be paired with another qualified Marine. The assignment was scheduled for the following morning. News traveled quietly through the kennel long before paperwork reached the office. The young Marine selected as Atlas's new handler spent the evening reviewing every report ever written about the German Shepherd and every mission completed beside Caleb Rowe. He memorized commands, routines, medical records, and training notes, But one sentence written near the bottom of an evaluation lingered in his thoughts longer than the rest. It simply read, "Trust was never trained. It was earned together." As the lights dimmed across the kennel that night, Atlas remained awake beside Caleb's folded jacket, listening to the distant waves rolling against the California shoreline, while somewhere beyond the quiet darkness another sunrise slowly prepared to test a promise neither time nor distance had yet managed to erase. Morning sunlight filtered through the eucalyptus trees surrounding the kennel complex, filling the air with the familiar scent of damp leaves and ocean salt. Atlas remained beside Caleb Rowe's folded field jacket until the sound of careful footsteps approached his gate. The young Marine assigned to become his new handler stopped several feet away and remained standing in complete silence. He held the tactical lead loosely in one hand, but made no effort to unlock the gate. Instead, he slowly placed the lead on the concrete outside the entrance and stepped back. Atlas glanced toward him for only a moment before lowering his eyes to the jacket again. The Marine understood immediately that this was not fear, anger, or stubbornness. It was loyalty that had nowhere else to go. After several quiet minutes, he lowered himself onto the concrete walkway, resting his forearms on his knees as morning birds sang from the nearby trees. "I am not here to replace him," he said softly. His voice carried no command, only honesty. Atlas listened without moving. The words floated through the still air before disappearing into the gentle breeze blowing across Camp Pendleton. The Marine did not repeat himself. He simply waited. Nearly half an hour passed before kennel staff quietly resumed their work around them. Food carts rolled across the pavement. Handlers prepared other military working dogs for training. Boots echoed across the sidewalks. Atlas noticed every familiar sound, yet his attention never fully left the folded jacket beneath his paw. Finally, the Marine stood, picked up the untouched lead, and opened the kennel gate without entering. He remained outside, leaving Atlas free to decide. After several long seconds, Atlas slowly rose to his feet. He walked out of the kennel without hesitation, but stopped exactly where Caleb had always paused before crossing toward the training field. The Marine recognized the invisible line immediately. He did not pull the lead or encourage Atlas forward. Instead, he stood quietly beside him, facing the same direction. For several minutes, neither of them moved. The breeze carried the distant crash of Pacific waves while a flag snapped gently above the headquarters building. Atlas stared toward the road leading east, the same road Caleb had traveled weeks before. The Marine quietly understood that Atlas was waiting for someone, not refusing a command. Together, they eventually returned to the training field. Atlas completed every familiar exercise with flawless precision. He responded to hand signals. He navigated obstacles with calm confidence. He located hidden training objects exactly as expected. Yet whenever the route turned toward the main exit gate, Atlas stopped. His paws remained firmly planted on the ground. No amount of gentle encouragement persuaded him to take another step. The Marine simply nodded and ended the session early. That afternoon, instead of filing a report describing a difficult transition, he requested complete access to every document connected to Caleb's disappearance. Maps covered his office desk until sunset. Weather reports, radio logs, search routes, maintenance records, and field notes slowly formed a picture that still contained too many unanswered questions. As darkness settled across the base, a communications technician knocked quietly on his open office door while holding a portable storage device recovered from the damaged radio found in the hills. "We have been restoring corrupted recordings all week," the technician explained. "Most of them are nothing but static, but there is one file we have not been able to decode completely." The Marine accepted the device without saying a word. Outside his office window, Atlas once again sat facing the eastern road, waiting beneath the first evening stars. Inside the communications building, the technician connected the restored memory unit to an aging receiver, adjusted the volume, and pressed play, unaware that the next few seconds would change far more than anyone inside the room could possibly imagine. The old receiver filled the communications room with a soft blanket of static that rose and faded like waves reaching an empty shore. Every technician leaned forward, listening for anything that might still exist beneath the damaged recording. The young Marine stood silently beside the control desk, his eyes fixed on the small speaker, while the restored file played through layers of interference collected from days of wind, rain, and distance. At first there was nothing except broken fragments of sound. Then came the faint rush of moving water. A hollow metallic chime drifted through the recording, rising and falling with the breeze. One technician adjusted the frequency another fraction. The static softened. A weak breath became audible. Then a quiet voice emerged from the noise, tired but unmistakably human. "Atlas." The room became completely still. Nobody reached for the controls. Nobody spoke. Nearly 100 yards away, inside the kennel complex, Atlas lifted his head before the recording had even finished. His ears stood perfectly upright. Every muscle beneath his black and tan coat became alert. The folded field jacket slipped quietly from beneath his paw as he rose without hesitation. The young Marine heard the sound of claws touching concrete behind him long before he realized what had happened. Atlas crossed the kennel in 3 steady strides and stopped at the closed gate, staring directly toward the communications building. His breathing remained calm, but his eyes had changed. For the first time since Caleb Rowe disappeared, hope replaced the distant emptiness that had settled there for weeks. The kennel attendant quickly opened the gate. Atlas did not run wildly across the compound. Instead, he moved with quiet certainty, following a path only he seemed able to understand. The young Marine hurried beside him, allowing the tactical lead to hang loose without pulling. Atlas guided them straight to the communications building entrance and stopped outside the doorway. Inside, the damaged recording continued to play. Again, the faint voice whispered his name. Atlas stepped into the room, lowered his head toward the old receiver, and gently pressed his nose against the edge of the equipment. He inhaled slowly, almost reverently, as though searching for something invisible hidden inside the cold metal casing. The technicians watched in silence. Then the recording continued beyond the single word everyone had noticed first. Beneath the static came the gentle sound of flowing water, followed by 3 evenly spaced metallic taps echoing somewhere nearby. The young Marine replayed the recording several more times. Each playback revealed the same pattern. Water, wind, 3 distinct metal strikes. One senior technician quietly unfolded a regional maintenance map and traced his finger towards several abandoned utility stations scattered throughout the eastern hills. Most had been unused for years, but one location still contained an old wind-driven signal bell mounted beside a concrete maintenance shelter. During strong coastal gusts, the bell produced the exact rhythm heard in the recording. The room fell silent once again as everyone slowly recognized the possibility forming before them. Atlas remained motionless beside the receiver until the recording ended. Then he turned toward the exit and gently tightened the lead for the very first time. He was not resisting the Marine beside him anymore. He was asking him to follow. The young Marine looked down into Atlas's steady brown eyes and understood that trust had quietly begun to grow between them, not because Caleb had been forgotten, but because finding him had become something they now carried together. Without another word, he gathered the maps, called the overnight search coordinator, and prepared a new mission that would begin before the first light of dawn reached the hills beyond Camp Pendleton. Before sunrise painted the California hills with the first shades of gold, a small convoy rolled quietly through the eastern gate of Camp Pendleton. The cool morning air carried the scent of damp earth left behind by the recent storms, and a thin layer of mist rested gently between the oak trees covering the hills ahead. Atlas sat calmly beside the young Marine inside the lead vehicle, wearing the same tactical collar Caleb Rowe had fastened countless mornings before. Resting carefully beside him was Caleb's old work glove, sealed inside a protective evidence bag until moments earlier. Before leaving the base, the young Marine had removed it with permission and allowed Atlas one long breath. The German shepherd closed his eyes for only a second before opening them again with quiet certainty. As the convoy reached the point where previous search teams had ended their assignments, Atlas stepped onto the soft ground without hesitation. The tactical lead remained loose in the Marine's hand. Nobody issued commands. Nobody rushed him forward. The search team had quietly agreed that this morning, Atlas was not simply accompanying the mission. He was leading it. The trail first followed the familiar maintenance road already explored several times during the previous weeks. Tire tracks had long since faded beneath fresh rain and scattered leaves. Search markers placed by earlier teams still hung from low branches, gently moving in the breeze. Atlas walked past every marker without slowing. His pace remained steady, his nose occasionally lifting into the cool air before returning toward the ground. Nearly half a mile farther, he stopped at a narrow bend where the maintenance road continued uphill. For several silent seconds, he studied the open path before turning away from it completely. Instead, he moved toward a barely visible trail disappearing beneath tall grass and weathered oak branches. Several members of the search team exchanged uncertain glances. According to every previous map, the forgotten path led only to an abandoned utility corridor closed years earlier after erosion damaged the original access road. The young Marine looked down at Atlas, then quietly remembered the words he had spoken the day before. He tightened his backpack, loosened the lead even further, and gave only one calm instruction. Find him. Atlas stepped forward immediately. The overgrown trail narrowed until branches brushed softly against uniforms and backpacks. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees and scattered beams while birds called somewhere high above the hillside. A small stream crossed the path, its clear water creating the same gentle sound preserved inside the damaged radio recording. The young Marine paused beside the flowing water and replayed the audio in his memory. It matched almost perfectly. Atlas continued without looking back. Several hundred yards later, another familiar sound drifted through the quiet forest. A hollow metallic chime rose and faded with the wind. Everyone stopped at once. Far ahead, partly hidden behind climbing vines and weathered concrete, stood an old maintenance station that no longer appeared on current operational maps. Above its rusted roofline, an aging wind-driven signal bell swayed gently with every coastal breeze, striking the same slow rhythm heard on the recovered recording. Atlas reached the building first, but did not circle it excitedly. Instead, he slowed to a careful walk, lowered his nose toward the ground, and followed an invisible trail around the side of the structure. The young Marine felt his heartbeat quicken as Atlas approached a weathered steel service door tucked beneath an overhanging concrete wall. The German Shepherd stopped directly in front of it, lifted his head, and stood perfectly still. No bark broke the silence. No frantic movement disturbed the peaceful morning. He simply waited, listening with complete focus to something only he could hear beyond the closed door. Atlas remained perfectly still before the weathered steel door, his ears turning slightly as the wind carried the familiar metallic chime across the hillside once more. The search team instinctively stopped several feet behind him, allowing the quiet to settle over the abandoned maintenance station. Moss covered the cracked concrete walls, and climbing vines wrapped themselves around rusted railings that had not been touched in years. A narrow stream flowed nearby, its gentle current matching the soft sound preserved inside the damaged radio recording. The young Marine slowly stepped beside Atlas and rested one hand lightly against the tactical lead without pulling. Every instinct told him to trust what the German Shepherd had already found. Atlas lowered his head and gently placed one paw against the bottom of the steel door. There was no scratching, no frantic movement, only one calm touch followed by complete stillness. Everyone listened. For several long seconds, nothing answered except the breeze moving through the trees above. Then, from somewhere beyond the thick metal door, came the faint sound of movement. It was almost too soft to notice. A boot shifting across concrete. A careful breath. Atlas immediately raised his head. His tail moved once. Not with excitement, but with certainty. The young Marine leaned closer to the door and called clearly, "Staff Sergeant Caleb Rowe. This is a United States Marine search team. If you can hear us, give us any response you can." Silence returned. Several members of the team exchanged concerned glances, wondering whether they had imagined the sound. Then, carried through the narrow gaps around the old door, came a weak but unmistakable voice. "Atlas." The German Shepherd closed his eyes for the briefest moment. His ears relaxed. He stepped forward until his nose rested gently against the cold steel. A quiet sound escaped him, not a bark, not a whine, but something deeper, a breath that seemed to carry every day he had spent waiting beside the kennel gate. Inside the maintenance shelter, Caleb had survived by carefully rationing emergency supplies stored within the old utility station. The heavy storms had caused part of the hillside to shift, blocking the main exit and leaving only limited access to damaged communication equipment. Every attempt to transmit a signal had been interrupted by weak power and difficult terrain. Only one short recording had managed to leave the station before the battery failed completely. The young Marine immediately radioed the search coordinator, requesting engineering support, while the rest of the team carefully inspected the entrance. The old locking mechanism had seized with age, but the structure itself remained stable. Rather than forcing the door open, they worked methodically, removing debris and clearing the blocked frame piece by piece. Throughout the entire process, Atlas never moved away. He remained beside the door, calm and patient, listening to every quiet sound from the other side. Minutes later, the final section of debris was carefully lifted away, and the steel door slowly opened inward with a long, tired creak. Soft morning light reached into the dim shelter for the first time in weeks. Caleb sat against the far wall, thinner than when he had left Camp Pendleton, but fully conscious, his weathered field notebook resting beside him. For one silent heartbeat, Atlas simply looked at him. Weeks of waiting, searching, and hoping stood between them like an invisible distance that neither of them seemed ready to cross. Caleb smiled gently despite his exhaustion. With slow hands, he reached into his jacket pocket, removed the remaining work glove that matched the one Atlas had carried in memory, lifted it slightly, and whispered the single word that had always meant every journey was over. Home. The word settled into the quiet shelter like the first ray of sunlight after a long storm. Home. Caleb Rowe did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Atlas stared at the worn leather glove resting in Caleb's outstretched hand, then looked into the familiar blue eyes that had guided him through countless mornings along the California coast. For one long heartbeat, the German shepherd remained perfectly still, almost as though he needed to be certain that hope was no longer another memory. Then he took one careful step forward. Another followed. The tactical lead slipped gently from the young Marine's hand without anyone noticing. Atlas crossed the remaining distance at an unhurried pace before lowering his head against Caleb's chest. Caleb wrapped both arms around his lifelong partner, resting his forehead softly against Atlas's neck while the quiet sound of the wind-driven bell continued outside. No cheers broke the silence. No one hurried to interrupt the moment. Every Marine standing near the doorway understood they were witnessing something too deeply personal for words. After several peaceful minutes, the medical team completed a careful examination and confirmed that Caleb was tired, dehydrated, and in need of rest, but otherwise remarkably well. As they prepared to leave the shelter, Atlas never wandered more than a few inches from Caleb's side. Each time Caleb stood, Atlas stood. Each time Caleb paused, Atlas quietly waited beside him. The journey back through the hills felt completely different from the one that had brought the search team there. Morning sunlight now streamed through the oak trees, warming the damp trails while birds filled the forest with gentle songs. The forgotten maintenance path no longer seemed lonely. It had become the road that carried one promise safely home. When the convoy finally returned to Camp Pendleton, word spread quietly across the base before the vehicles even reached the kennel complex. Marines paused along sidewalks, mechanics stepped outside maintenance bays, and kennel staff gathered near the entrance without speaking loudly. Caleb climbed out of the vehicle slowly, smiling with grateful eyes as Atlas stepped onto the pavement beside him. The German shepherd did not race ahead toward the kennel. He remained exactly where he had always belonged, walking shoulder to shoulder with Caleb. The young Marine who had cared for Atlas during those difficult weeks approached with respectful hesitation. Before he could say a word, Caleb extended his hand. "Thank you for believing him," he said sincerely. The young Marine shook his hand, then looked down at Atlas with a quiet smile. "He was never waiting for orders," he replied. "He was waiting for you." Several days later, after Caleb had fully recovered, the three of them walked together toward the familiar wooden footbridge overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The afternoon breeze carried the comforting scent of salt water and eucalyptus leaves exactly as it had so many mornings before. Caleb reached into his pocket and removed the old leather ball that had waited inside his locker ever since he disappeared. Atlas caught it with the same effortless grace that had always made Caleb laugh. When the game ended, Caleb knelt beside him once again and rested one steady hand against the tactical collar. This time another hand joined his. The young Marine gently touched Atlas's shoulder, no longer as a replacement, but as someone the German shepherd had quietly accepted into the circle of trust Caleb had built through years of patience and kindness. Together they watched the sun sink toward the Pacific horizon while Atlas rested peacefully between them. The wind moved softly across the water, carrying no promises that needed to be spoken anymore, because some bonds do not survive simply through loyalty. They survive because love remembers the way home even after every road has disappeared.